Hey guys, this is Joseph Fabio here. Today we'll be doing the second, part two of every team's NFL schedule thing. So first we got the Las Vegas Raiders. It does not show, so we're gonna skip. But now we got the Los Angeles Chargers. In week 1, they're playing the Miami Dolphins. I think that's gonna be a loss. Then they got the Titans. That's gonna be a win. Vikings loss. Raiders win. So they're 2-2. Cowboys loss. Chiefs loss. So they're 2-4, but then they lose to the Bears. They beat the Bears, so they're 3-4. But then they lose to the Jets, so they're 3-5. Then they lose to the Lions, so they're 3-6. But then they beat the Packers, so they're 4-6. Then they lose to the Ravens, so they're 4-7. Then they beat the Patriots, so they're 5-7. Then they beat the Broncos, so they're 6-7. Then they beat the Raiders, so they're 7-7. And then they beat the Bills. They lose to the Bills, so they're 7-8. Then they beat the Broncos and they lose to the Chiefs, so they're 8-9. They finish out the season 8-9. This is gonna be not a bad year for them. I think they will sneak into the playoffs. So in their division, they have the Chiefs and they have the Raiders and Broncos. Yeah, so I think they'll probably sneak into the playoffs just because their division is only going to be the Chiefs in the playoffs. So I think they'll sneak in. Anyways, now we got the Los Angeles Rams. And in week 1, they have the Seattle Seahawks. That's going to be... they're not home in this game. So it's actually going to be really, really tough to win. But I'm going to go here with... You know what? They're going to beat the Seahawks. Guys, we know the Rams are going to do a lot better this year. But now they have the 49ers. That's going to be a loss. Then they got the Bengals. That's going to be a loss. So they're 1-2. But then they beat the Colts. Then they lose to the Eagles. So they're 2-3. But then they beat the Cardinals. So they're 3-3. They beat the Steelers. So they're 4-3. But then they lose to the Cowboys, so they're 4-4. They beat the Packers, so they're 5-4. They beat the Seahawks, so they're 6-4. They beat the Cardinals, so they're 7-4. They beat the Browns, so they're 8-4. Then they lose to the Ravens, so they're 8-5. Then they beat the Commanders, so they're 9-5. Then they beat the Saints, so they're 10-5. They beat the Giants, so they're 11-5. But then they lose to the 49ers. And I think they'll finish off the season 11-6 and just do a lot better. And I don't think they'll make the Super Bowl, but they'll make I think they'll make the divisional round and lose. But they're still doing a lot better. They'll do a lot better next year. But now we got the Miami Dolphins. And we have to click here. Okay. So, in week 1, they're playing the Los Angeles Chargers. I think that's going to be a win. Then they have the Patriots. That's going to be a win. Then they got the Broncos. That's going to be a win. But then they got the Bills. That's going to be a loss. But then they got the Giants. That's going to be a win. Panthers win. So there's 5-1. But then they lose to the Eagles. And then they beat the Patriots. And then they lose to the Chiefs. So they're 6-3. And then they beat the Raiders. So they're 7-3. And then they have a really tough game against the Jets. I think they'll lose, so they're 7-4. Then they beat the Commanders, so they're 8-4. Then they beat the Titans, so they're 9-4. Then they beat the Jets, so they're 10-4. They lose to the Cowboys, so they're 10-5. They beat the Ravens, so they're 11-5. And then they beat the Bills, so they finish off the season 12-5. I think they'll do very good. Actually, no, they lose to the Bills, so they finish off the season 11-6, and it's not bad at all. I actually think it's really good. Last year they went 9-8, but now we got the Vikings, and it doesn't say, so we got to skip off this. Now we got the New England Patriots, man. This is not going to be their year, but in week 1 they have the Philadelphia Eagles. I think that's going to be a loss. Then they have the Dolphins. That's going to be a loss. Then they have the Jets. That's going to be a loss. Then they have the Cowboys. That's going to be a loss. And then they got the Saints. That's going to be a loss. So they're 0-5. They lose to the Raiders, so they're 0-6. Then they lose to the Bills, so they're 0-7. They lose to the Dolphins, so they're 0-8. But then they finally get a win against the Washington Commanders, so they're 1-8. Then they beat the Colts, so they're 2-8. Going into the bye, they lose to the Giants, so they're 2-9. Then they lose to the Chargers, so they're 2-10. They lose to the Steelers, so they're 2-11. They lose to the Chiefs, so they're 2-12. They beat the Broncos, so they're 3-12. Then they lose to the Bills and they lose to the Jets. So they finish out the season 3-14. This is not going to be their year. So yeah. And now we got the Saints. And in week 1 they have the Tennessee Titans. I think this is gonna win. This is gonna be a win. And then they got the Panthers. That's gonna be a win. Packers win. Bucks win. Patriots win. Texans win. So they're 6-0, believe it or not. But then they got the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think this is gonna be their loss. And then they got the Colts. That's gonna be a win. So they're 7-1. They beat the Bears. So they're 8-1. They have a really tough game against the Vikings. I think they lose here, so they're 8-2. Then they beat the Falcons, so they're 9-2. Then they lose to the Lions, so they're 9-3. Then they beat the Panthers, so they're 9-4. They beat the Giants, so they're 10-3. And then they beat the Giants, so they're 11-3. And then they lose to the Rams, so they're 11-4. They beat the Bucks, so they're 12-4. And then they finish out the season 13-4, beating the Falcons. They just have a really easy schedule, so yeah. But now we have the New York Giants. And in week 1 they have the Dallas Cowboys. That's gonna be a loss. And then they have Cardinals. That's gonna be a win. Then they have the 49ers. That's gonna be a loss. And then they lose to the Seahawks, so they're 1-3. And then they lose to the Dolphins, so they're 1-4. And they lose to the Bills, so they're 1-5. But then they beat the Commanders, so they're 2-5. They lose to the Jets, and then they beat the Raiders, so they're 3-6. Then they lose to the Cowboys, so they're 3-7. They beat the Commanders, so they're 4-7. They beat the Patriots, so they're 5-7. They beat the Packers, so they're 6-7. They're starting to come back. And then they lose to the Saints, so they're 6-8. They lose to the Eagles, so they're 6-9. They lose to the Rams, so they're 6-10. And they finish off the season 6-11, losing to the Philadelphia Eagles. So yeah, 6-11 for the Giants, just because they have a tough schedule. And now we have the New York Jets. And in week 1, they have the Buffalo Bills. This is going to be a really tough game. Really, really tough game. But I think they'll win this game. So they're 1-0. But then they have the Cowboys. That's going to be a win. Patriots win. But then they lose to the Chiefs, so they're 3-1. They beat the Broncos, so they're 4-1. They lose to the Eagles, so they're 4-2. They beat the Giants, so they're 5-2. They beat the Chargers, so they're 6-2. They beat the Raiders, so they're 7-2. They lose to the Bills, so they're 7-3. They lose to the Dolphins, so they're 7. Actually, no, they beat the Dolphins, so they're 8-3. They beat the Falcons, so they're 9-3. They beat the Texans, so they're 10-3. They beat the Dolphins, so they're they lose to the Dolphins, so they're 10-4. They beat the Commanders, so they're 11-4. They beat the Browns, so they're 12-4, and they finish out the season 13-4, beating the New England Patriots. And then we have the Philadelphia Eagles, and in week 1 they have the Patriots. This is definitely going to be a win. And then they have the Vikings. That's going to be a win, so they're 2-0. But then they beat the Bucks. They beat the Commanders. They beat the Rams, so they're 5-0. Then they have the Jets. This is going to be a really, really tough game, but I think they win, so they're 6-0. They beat the Dolphins, so they're 7-0. They beat the Commanders, so they're 8-0. And who are they playing in week 9? Cowboys. I don't know who's home in that game. I'll just say win. So they're 9-0. But then they have the Kansas City Chiefs returning from the bye, and that's going to be a loss. And then look at this. So they're 9-1, but then they beat the Bills, so they're 10-1. Then they lose to the 49ers, so they're 9-2. I mean they're 10-2. Then they lose to the Cowboys, so they're 10-3. And then they beat the Seahawks, so they're 11-3. They beat the Giants, so they're 12-3. They beat the Cardinals, so they're 13-3. And they finish off the season 14-3, beating the New York Giants. And yeah. So yeah. Actually, no, they lose to the Cowboys. Yeah, so they're in that game before the Chiefs. So they're 13-4 is their final record. So yeah. All right. Who's next? Who's after Philadelphia? The Pittsburgh Steelers. So in week 1, they have the San Francisco 49ers. And then in week 2, they have the Cleveland Browns. So they lose to the 49ers, but then beat the Browns, so they're 1-1. They beat the Raiders, so they're 2-1. They beat the Texans, so they're 3-1. They lose to the Ravens, so they're 3-2. And they go into the bye. And then they lose to the Rams, so they're 3-3. They lose to the Jags, so they're 3-4. They beat the Titans, so they're 4-4. They beat the Packers, so they're 5-4. They lose to the Browns, so they're 5-5. They lose to the Bengals, so they're 5-6. They beat the Cardinals, so they're 6-6. Then they beat the Patriots, so they're 7-6. And then they beat the Colts, so they're 8-6. And then they lose to the Bengals, and so they're 8-7. Then they beat the Seahawks, so they lose to the Seahawks, so they're 8-8. And then they finish off the season 8-9, losing to the Baltimore Ravens. They'll do good. They're just not gonna do they'll do about the same as last year. So yeah. But now we got the 49ers. And yeah. In week 1 they play we have the 49ers. In week 1 they play the Steelers. That's gonna be a win. And then they beat the Rams, so they're 2-0. Then they beat the Giants, so they're 3-0. They beat the Cardinals, so they're 4-0. They beat the Cowboys, so they're 5-0. They beat the Browns, so they're 6-0. They beat the Vikings, so they're 7-0. But then they lose to the Bengals, so they're 7-1. Going into the bye, they play the Jags. They win, so they're 8-1. Then they beat the Bucks, so they're 9-1. They beat the Seahawks, so they're 10-1. They beat the Eagles, so they're 11-1. They beat the Seahawks, so they're 12-1. They beat the Cardinals, so they're 13-1. They beat the Ravens, so they're 14-1. They beat the Commanders, so they're 15-1. And they beat they lose to the Rams, so they're 15-2 in this. I just think that their season is going to be unbelievable. 15-2. We hardly ever see that with any team. But now we have the Seattle Seahawks. And in week 1 they have I'm going to click on it because so in week 1 they have the Los Angeles Rams. This to me is going to be a loss, but then they lose to the Lions, so they're 0-2. But then they beat the Panthers and they beat the Giants, so they're 2-2. But then they lose to the Bengals, so they're 2-3. Then they beat the Cardinals and Browns, so they're 4-3. But then they lose to the Ravens, so they're 4-4. And then they beat the Commanders, so they're 5-4. They beat the Rams, so they're 6-4. And they lose to the 49ers and Cowboys, so they lose to the 49ers, so they're 6-5. Then they lose to the Cowboys, so they're 6-6. They lose to the 49ers, so they're 6-7. They lose to the Eagles, so they're 6-8. Then they beat the Titans, so they're 7-8. And then they beat the Steelers, so they're 8-8. And then they finish off the season 9-8, beating the Arizona Cardinals. I just think they have a tough schedule, so they finish off the season 9-8. And yeah. No! Why? have to restart now. So yeah, let's see here. Alright, so we did the 49ers, we did Seahawks, okay. So now, we got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and it does not say, so we're gonna skip. Now we got the Tennessee Titans. And in week 1, they have the New Orleans Saints. This, to me, is going to be a loss. Then they got the Chargers. That's going to be a loss. Then they have the Browns. That's going to be a loss, so they're 0-3. But then they lose to the Bengals, so they're 0-4. But then they beat the Colts, and they lose to the Ravens, so they're 1-5. They beat the Falcons, so they're 2-5. They lose to the Steelers, so they're 2-6. They beat the Bucks, so they're 3-6, and they lose to the Jags, so they're 3-7. They beat the Panthers, so they're 4-7. Then they beat the Colts, so they're 5-7. And then they lose to the Dolphins, so they're 5-8. Then they beat the Texans, so they're 6-8. Then they lose to the Seahawks, so they're 6-9. And then they beat the Texans, so they're 7-9. And then they finish off the season 7-10, losing to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now we have the final team. We have the Washington Commanders. And in week 1, they have the Arizona Cardinals. This is going to be a loss. Then they have the Seahawks. That's going to be a loss. Broncos loss. Giants loss. Bills loss. So they're Cardinals. So in week 1, they have the Cardinals. That's going to be a loss. Week 2, they have the Broncos. That's going to be a loss. And then they lose to the Bills. They lose to the Eagles. They lose to the Bears. They lose to the Falcons. Actually, no, they beat the Falcons, so they're 1-5. And then they lose to the Giants, so they're 1-6. They lose to the Eagles, so they're 1-7. Then they when's their bye week? Okay, I'm gonna check their bye week. Yo, when is their bye week? Oh, week 14. Okay. So yeah, they're still like 1-7. Then they beat the Patriots, so they're 2-7. Actually, no, they lose to the Patriots, so they're 1-8. They lose to the Seahawks, so they're 1-9. They lose to the Giants, so they're 1-10. They lose to the Cowboys, so they're 1-11. And then they beat the Dolphins. They lose to the Dolphins, so they're 1-12. They lose to the Rams, so they're 1-13. They lose to the Jets, so they're 1-14. They lose to the 49ers, so they're 1-15. And they lose to the Cowboys. They finish off the season 1-16. They are not going to do good at all next year. Sam Howell, the worst quarterback in the league. So yeah, guys, that'll do it for the series. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. So yeah, bye.